India, Dehradun. His primary interest is studying the ecology and conservation aspects of lesser known and threatened fauna. By training, he's a wildlife biologist. He's done his MSc Wildlife Sciences from WII again. He started his research career with a study on pheasant distribution in the eastern Himalayan biodiversity hotspots in the northeast India, following the discovery of the subspecies Sclatus monal pheasant, Laphophorus sclateri. He also studied in the Arunachal macaque, Macaca monzella from Western Arunachal Pradesh, India, and worked on the determination of the offshore distribution of olive ridley sea turtles, Lepidochelys olivacea, along the east coast of India. This latter work involved using satellite telemetry to understand the movements and migration of the ridley turtles. In 2008, he joined the Wildlife Institute of India as faculty. And he was also involved in the 29th Indian scientific expedition in 2009 in Antarctica. So without much ado, we'll ask Dr. Suresh Kumar to take over, and he'll be starting his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jobin, for that introduction. But that's quite some time ago. Been doing quite a bit of other tracking related work after that. So let me go ahead and share my presentation first. Is this visible?
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Yes.
Okay, now moving on to the slideshow. And,
so before we begin, it's being recorded, right? Sorry, just
yeah, it's been recorded. It's been live streaming. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Yambem, and thank you, Jobin. And starting off with my presentation, and it's always exciting to talk about bird migration. Okay, so I'm sitting here in Delhi and looking out of the window. The spring is set in, and there's a lot of birds possibly returning back from southern India. The cold is soon going to go. So let me start off with my presentation with a few visuals of landscapes up here in the north. As the evening sets in certain sites, this is a site in Gujarat where you would get to see mass movement of birds in some particular direction, and all gives you a feel of where these birds have come from and why are they going in this particular formation, or where exactly are they headed out. So more such sites that you get to see. This is a rosy starling, that murmuration that you call, these kind of displays in the air that they make in large flocks of birds, especially just before roosting for the night, or when they leave their roost in the day and leave. So such large gatherings of birds do give you a feel of where these birds have come from, because you only see them seasonally in certain sites and thereafter they are gone. So they are definitely visitors to many places, indicating to you that they don't belong to one particular place. So similar such sites, again, you do get of other birds. Here is the case of the barn swallows, all coming together, taking an afternoon siesta or in the daybreak, waiting for the sun to warm up, and then they would depart from here. So all of these again gives you that feel that there's something unique, something special about these birds, and they're all communicating with one another about the next destinations where they are headed to. Many such sites. Here is the case of the lesser flamingos. During the breeding season, they would congregate in very large numbers in select wetlands in the western part of India. Again, those wetlands would not have flamingos in other times of the year, but just at the onset of breeding, these birds would arrive in large flocks, numbering in thousands. So again, giving you a feel of where exactly are these birds coming from, and why are they congregating in such large numbers. Another visual of spectacular sights of mixed species of birds. You have the cranes there, and high up in the sky, you have a lot of waders and other water associated species that you get to see. So All of these things give you a feel that these birds are on an annual pilgrimage and that they are taking an annual pilgrimage and what we now call as migration. So I'm giving you these visuals, which is going to set stage for a series of questions that I would be addressing when it comes to understanding this amazing phenomenon that happens in nature, in the natural world. So a lot of people have written about it. So this person by name Gates wrote that strange and mysterious phenomenon in the life of birds, their migratory journeys repeated at fixed intervals and with unerring exactness has for thousands of years called forth the astonishment, admiration of mankind. So I'm sure this is what many of you interested in this course, looking at birds, you must have admired when you would have seen such formations of large number of birds flying in one particular direction. So this has always caught our imagination. I think since time that man started to walk erect, looking up in the sky, he would have admired what has been going on in the natural world. So the big question is, where do these birds come from? And where are they going? And why are they doing this? Why are they traveling thousands of kilometers? Why do they have to move between sites? What is triggering them to undertake these kinds of movements? So let's step back a little in time and see what ancient people thought about, taking on Aristotle, who has written so widely about the natural world. He believed that the cuckoo transformed itself into a hawk, or the hawk transformed itself into a cuckoo in different times of the year because they resemble very similar to one another. So suggesting that it's the same species, but they transmutate as to one another. In summer, the redstarts annually transform themselves into robin in winter because these are the kind of birds that they saw across the seasons. They never imagined that these small creatures could move far and wide. So that was the philosophy of that time, and this was quite well accepted all the way into the 18th and 19th century. And there is also Linnaeus, the famous man, who reported saying that swallows dipping into the surface of lakes and ponds. Aristotle, they spend the winter buried up in the lake bottom, and when summer arrives, they emerge out and start appearing everywhere. So even today, during my travels in Sikkim and parts of North Bengal, where you have a Nepali community, even they do believe that the swallows that they see in summer in their homes migrate to Kasi, and where they would commit suicide in the Ganga. And it's a completely different generation of birds that come. So this is the awareness about the whole concept of migration. It's still something that a lot of people cannot comprehend, that birds can go very far and return, and it's the same that return back each year. So of course, long before what we currently know of many birds about their incredible migration journeys, it all started off with simple capture and marking individuals by giving them some unique rings with a specific number or a color coded band on their legs or on their neck, and relocating them or resighting them or recapturing them has given us quite a bit of insight. So large-scale ringing programs in Europe, America, as well as in India, happening since the 60s, primarily undertaken by BNHS, have contributed quite a good amount of knowledge that a lot of birds are coming from different parts of the world. So we now know that birds do undertake such extensive travels and migrate far and wide. But of course, we do not know in detail as to what are those migratory routes, because this is a simple form of passive tracking method, which I'm going to be talking about later on in the presentation a little bit more in detail. So what we know today is that almost all around this beautiful planet of ours, birds occur, and they seem to have been able to colonize almost every inch of this planet. And almost all of these birds do show some form of movements. It could be short distance movements, long distance movements. And what we now know is approximately 40% of the world's total bird species undertake annual movements or migration. So coming to migration, what exactly is migration? Migrations are nothing but prolonged movements from one place to another, and it associated with a certain period of time. And it involves regular outward and return movements. And migrations are, like I mentioned earlier, periodic time, specific seasons, and tied to either their reproduction, and of course, it's driven by the endocrine system. Seen in those species that primarily face the problem of occupying a certain area, which may be suitable only for a certain time of the year, or a few months in a year. And so it's these species that have to undertake these migrations. Talking about birds that are able to move and migrate long distances, there are also a few species that have adapted to survive in harsh conditions and do not undertake migrations when most others would actually migrate. And one such is a bird known as the common ploverbill, found in North America, which is a species of niger, and could actually survive long cold spells in a torpid condition. So migration is, again, it's very important to understand that migration is distinct. It's different from dispersal. A lot of birds post-breeding or a certain time of the year, they would disperse. They would be there in a particular area, congregating together or using that area. Thereafter, they would disperse. Now, these movements, or the dispersal movements, are very distinct from migration, in that the migratory animals typically move from one geographic region to another without using the intervening habitat. Okay, so of course, a lot of birds would do stop over at several sites, but it's very important that between their non-breeding and breeding ground, there's a lot of areas that is not suitable to them. They do not use that area, they just make these fly paths. So this is very distinct from the dispersal. So there are lots of migration types. There are latitudinal migrants, there are longitudinal migrants moving along the longitudinal lines. There are altitudinal migrants if we are talking about mountainscapes, especially high up in the Himalayas. A lot of birds breeding in the alpine region move down to the lower elevations as it gets very, very cold. And then we talked about seasonal migration. Some are summer winters, some are winter visitors. And then many of these birds undertake trans-hemispheric migration, moving between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. And this also would mean trans-equatorial migration, which is basically moving across the equator during their entire annual journeys, migration journeys. And there are several other variations that birds do adopt. There are loop migrations or elliptical migrations, leapfrog migrations, and many other examples. And birds associated with marine landscapes rely on marine environments, and as a result, you can classify them under the oceanic migrants or species associated or dictated by ocean currents there. So patterns of bird migration generally is that migratory birds are mainly northern species. It's simply because the fact that most of the land masses on Earth, as we see today, is concentrated to the north. And so most birds would go down all the way down to, say, Argentina, the southern tip of Argentina, or Africa. They could even move further south. However, the landmass ends there. So as we see today, a large number of migratory species are associated with the Arctic, subarctic, and the temperate regions of the northern hemisphere. So many of these birds breed to the north to breed, move to the north to breed, and return again to the south for wintering. Migratory birds follow different migratory routes. Very often it is north-south migration. It could be east-west migration, and altitudinal migration, and seabird migration. Within a species, some populations may not move at all. Some may move only a short distance, and others may migrate very far. So you basically would see a lot of variations in the way birds move across these different landscapes, and all dictated by the climatic conditions, food availability, and many other factors that have actually led to these so-called adaptations in these birds. So a species that comes to my mind when we talk about north-south migration, or this is something like a latitudinal migrant, which is the common crane, which has a very wide distribution range all across the Eurasian region. It's also known as the Eurasian crane. Different populations would move to different wintering sites. As you can see, it's marked in the blue region. And again, as summer sets in, they return back to the northern latitudes. As I speak, populations of northern common cranes wintering in the state of Gujarat and Rajasthan are getting ready to start back on their annual journey of going back to their breeding grounds in the northern latitudes. Then we have other interesting species like the barn swallows, which have started to arrive in the Himalayas as spring has already set in. And then you have the pied cuckoo, which is a summer visitor to the Indian subcontinent. It is yet to arrive, probably waiting for the right kind of wind conditions for it to migrate, possibly coming from southern Africa, or populations coming from southern India to the northern India. So these are a few examples of summer migrants coming to the northern India. All of these species have a big role in the local folklore. There is a lot of mention about these birds, and so local people look at some of these birds in a very different way than generally any other species. This is again another important species, the bar-headed geese, which again moves north-south and a latitudinal migrant. The Indian subcontinent is one of the main wintering grounds for this particular species. What is also very interesting here is that this bird holds the record for being able to fly at the highest elevation, because they make these high altitude crossings over the Himalayas. As a feature which is something impossible for many birds to actually cross over. However, the bar-headed geese seem to be quite easily manage their crossing over the high Himalayas and move across into the Tibetan plateau and the Mongolian steppe landscape to breed. It's not just that only large-bodied birds are migratory in nature. In fact, a higher percentage of small passerine birds undertake migrations, and many of them undertake long distance migrations. So which is very, very interesting how a small 10 to 15 gram bird can actually undertake such long distance migrations, and a few even do cross across habitats which are generally considered as ecological barriers. So here is a fantastic example of the Blythe's reed warbler. The entire population of this species is winters in India. And you can see this at this point of time, they are wintering in India. And in a few weeks or a month, they would start back on their journey to their Palearctic or to the European breeding grounds. So this is again a very, very interesting example, data coming in through citizen science scientists, and we are able to visualize these movements better. Now, this is yet again a very, very interesting bird when it comes to the Himalayan crossings undertaken by a select number of birds. This is of the damoisil crane, a beautiful crane, and from a very recent publication. And this particular research has been on for several years. And this is a very good example of a loop migration. Interestingly, there are different populations breeding in the northern latitudes in the Central Asian region, in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and also in Mongolia, and then in eastern China. But when it is time to winter, these populations move down cut across the Himalayas in central Nepal, funneling through some river gorges, not actually crossing over the mountains, and then coming down into the Indian region or the Gangetic plains and cutting across to the to the Gujarat state. So the populations in the northern latitudes of the Indian subcontinent, primarily from the Central Asian flyway or the region, they winter in Gujarat. The entire populations of demersal cranes winter here. On the return migration, however, they take a different route. They fly towards Pakistan, Afghanistan, go into Uzbekistan, which is an important passage stopover site, and from there go off back to their breeding sites. So the question is, why do these birds undertake this kind of a migration? There are several hypotheses, or at least two hypotheses, that have been put forward from this particular research, which I will talk about it a little later. Now, even birds that we commonly see in the Indian subcontinent, the black kite, of course, here this is the lineatus species, which moves between northern India and coming all the way from the Mongolian steppe, as well as the Russian Arctic, subarctic regions. And very interestingly, the black kite, this particular population, the research clearly says that they do undertake crossings all the way up at 6,000 meters. So this is incredible for a species, a soaring species, which like the black kite undertakes this migration. But what is very evident here is that it does try to avoid the Tibetan plateau, because what we also know from other research studies of birds tagged in eastern China, they enter into the eastern part of India, primarily occurring in the Brahmaputra Valley and the Manipur or the Imphal Valley there. So they do respond to these high Himalayan range in a way, avoiding that and circumventing it by entering either from the west or from the east. This is yet again a very interesting species known as the Oriental Platin coal, which is a species commonly seen in the Indian subcontinent or peninsular Indian region. A recent satellite tagging effort by Australian researchers found that these birds arrive in northern parts of Karnataka, and they again make a very interesting migratory route. On the way up north, on their way to India, they fly over Indonesia and then into Southeast Asia and enter via Odisha and arrive in here in northern Karnataka. But on the return migration, take a completely different route. This particular route appears to be a much more longish oceanic crossing that they are undertaking. Fascinating study. A lot more interesting insights are yet to come from this, but completely changes our perspective of what birds are capable of doing. One of the species that has been studied in recent times and has been breaking records after records over the years, and is possibly the Guinness, and it is in fact the Guinness Book of World Record holder. This is the bar-tailed godwit. Populations of these birds that breed in Alaska, undertake these non-stop flights of several thousand kilometers. In this case, a 4-month-old bar-tailed godwit undertook a trans-hemispheric journey, cutting across the equator, coming down to New Zealand and to Australia. And this particular individual was found to have arrived in Tasmania and made a non-stop flight of almost 11 days. And then on the return migration, these birds, take a different route via the East Asia, Australasia coastline, stopping over at select places, possibly fattening, and returning back to their breeding ground. So these stopover sites are sites where they, feed extensively, or what we call as fattening, or more technically known as hyperphagia. So these stopover sites are extremely important for these birds, for their survival, for their ability to undertake their migrations, and also dictates how well they are going to, their reproductive output that particular year is going to be. So these sites are very small relatively when you compare across their range, but extremely important. So protection of these sites becomes important, and that becomes a challenge given that a lot of coastal reclamation is happening, and this particular species being associated with tidal areas, it is definitely a very challenging issue to manage. So There are also the other famous examples of birds like the Arctic tern, which moves between the poles and as a result travels several thousand kilometers. I think if I remember right, all the way to the tune of about 75,000 kilometers. It is moving up and down between the poles during the breeding and non-breeding season. But what is possible for this particular bird is that it could land anywhere, and it could take off anywhere from it basically uses the ocean currents and the marine environment. But this is not the case in the previous example where we saw the bar-tailed godwit, which is a bird associated with water, but it cannot land in the middle of water. Another example of an oceanic migrant, the sooty shearwater, it moves with the jet streams in all of the major oceans. And so clearly they are seen in a certain time of the year, and they primarily breed during the southern summer. And and again, a very interesting species of an example of oceanic migrant. An example that I would like to give of a bird which I'm very familiar with is the Amur falcon. There have been a few tracking studies, but what is again interesting is that all of the world's Amur falcons that we know now migrate or funnel into northeastern part of India in select sites. So why do they migrate in such large numbers or funnel into such large numbers or congregate in such sites? What is it that is driving them to stop over here? Are they resting? Are they foraging? What is it there? So now we know that these sites provide them ample amount of food, and this is where they undergo hyperphagia or fattening, put on fat reserves, which is extremely important or crucial for their ability to undertake non-stop flights from here on. So these stopover sites, or the fattening areas, or where they put on fat reserves, are primarily between the northeastern India and then on the return migration from Somalia. So the breeding grounds, they come down into northeast India, stop over, fatten up, and make these non-stop flights of almost 6,000 kilometers, which includes a 3,000 kilometer over the Arabian Sea, stop over in Somalia, and then start moving down to southern Africa. And so as a result is the trans-equatorial migrant or a trans-hemispheric migrant. And on the return migration, surprisingly again, this bird takes a northerly route and not the same route as it had come down. So the question arises, why? So we'll try and answer those later in the study. One another bird which also occurs in almost very similar habitats as that of the Amur falcon, but more a commensal species occurring in human habitations in northeastern China. This is known as the common swift, one of the commonest swifts in the higher latitudes. Recent studies on this is a very small bird, but a very unique tag had been deployed on this. This is known as the geolocator tag. And this particular species clearly avoids oceanic crossings and primarily associates itself to the arid regions of the northern latitudes as well as the southern latitudes, and moves between the Far East Asia and southern Africa. Unlike the Amur falcon, it doesn't make these oceanic crossings. So you can imagine, these birds making a 30,000 kilometer journey every year up and down. So when you hear about these stories of these birds, of these non-stop flights that they are able to undertake, so the ability of these birds is truly a test of their endurance. And without doubt, this is one of the most remarkable acts in the animal kingdom that we have seen. So the birds may be seen migrating almost anywhere. So their pathways or flyways or their routes. But geographic features and food availability in a certain area tend to funnel them, like as I had mentioned about the Amur falcon. Now we know very well that it is these pockets in northeast India that where they are going to get enough food, so they're going to funnel into these sites. And mountain ranges, large bodies of water, river systems, oceans, coastlines, and deserts create guides and obstacles. So for certain species, these may guide them. So for example, the Himalayan axis, definitely many of these birds circumvent that. So, and then move along the axis, but a lot of them, for a lot of them, this is a barrier, an ecological barrier or an obstacle. And as a result, this has shaped flyways or migratory routes to a certain for many species, and to some extent has also influenced their destinations, or has determined where they would basically end up. Now, again, when we talk about migratory birds and birds on migration, very often the question arises, at what heights are these birds flying? So we know from quite a few studies, from radar studies particularly, that a lot of birds, especially small passerine birds like swifts and swallows, fly within about 2,000 feet. This is the zone. So they fly low, taking benefit of low winds in certain times of the year. And that would mean that these birds, again, their timing of undertaking these migrations are going to be different. And then likewise, as you move up, you would see that most songbirds are confined to less than 15,000 or slightly more than 10,000 feet in height. Then we have the ducks and geese, which fly very high up. And of course, we have the vultures, eagles, and hawks that are generally soaring birds. So they generally fly very, very high, but they may not be necessarily flying that high up during migration. They may be soaring high up, taking benefit of thermals, but not necessarily that they do fly up. So currently, the world record holder is the bar-headed geese, which is seen flying up. And there are occasional few records like the Ruppel's vulture that also have been recorded flying really, really high, but maybe not during migration. So in many species of birds, birds of in different age and sexes tend to migrate to somewhat different time. So this is what we call as differential migration. So some birds, the males would fly earlier, the females would follow them. In some, it is the reverse. And in certain cases, the young birds leave later, and the adults, move ahead much, much earlier. Like in the case of the cuckoos. The cuckoos are one very interesting example. They may not stay because they are brood parasites, and their job is over once they have parasitized their host. And it's the job of the host to raise the young. And so the adults would possibly migrate off to their wintering destinations, while the young raised by their host take some more time and depart much later. So there are several hypotheses relating to this differential migration. One of this is the body size hypothesis, where smaller individuals migrate greater distances. So it's basically that it's their inability to survive harsh northern winter conditions. So you would see that generally the smaller birds moving far, far down south. The dominance hypothesis talks about subordinate birds migrating greater distances as a result of competition with socially dominant birds. The early arrival hypothesis talks about, it's primarily a result of sexual selection. And so birds, especially the territorial sex, if it's a male, they reach earlier in order to hold the breeding grounds, and so as a result undertake shorter migration. There are other hypotheses also, like for example the energy minimization hypothesis. So the routes that certain birds take, like for example the demoiselle crane's case, the autumn migration route is more about conserving energy, and so it is known as the energy minimization hypothesis. So they do try to funnel into the Himalayas to come to their wintering grounds in Gujarat, and not circumvent and take a longish migratory route. On the return migration, they could be undertaking a reverse, so which is time minimization hypothesis. So there are several hypotheses that are associated with many of these migrant birds. In springs, the males of many species of songbirds precede the females, presumably because it is to a male's advantage to arrive in its breeding ground or breeding area early and stake out its territory before its rivals do. In many shorebirds, for example, the parents abandon their precocial young on their breeding grounds and head south in mid to late summer, and the young follows weeks or months later. This is another example apart from the cuckoos that I had narrated. So now, having seen that there are these different migratory routes and different strategies adopted by birds, but the main question is, why do birds migrate? So birds migrate primarily because the resources on Earth fluctuate, the food resources that these birds are dependent on. And the summer months associated with the warm period of the year may be followed by inhospitable cold. And this is primarily the case in the northern latitudes. So plants or other food resources may be abundant in those areas during those short summer months, but only for a short period of time. So this again dictates that those birds, strategizing to use those resource-rich sites in the northern latitudes, only use those sites for that particular period of time, maximizing on the super and abundant availability of food. So there are also other situations where this may not directly pertains to birds, but generally other species such as sea turtles or whales, where the best place to give birth or hatch young may not be a good place to find food. So in the case of sea turtles, this is definitely the case. They move down to these nesting beaches to lay eggs, and those may not necessarily be sites where they get enough forage. Now, so definitely, as we have seen, migration is influenced by the seasons across the planet. And this is influenced by the tilt of the Earth. And as Earth revolves around the orbit or on its orbit around the sun, there is the shift in the seasons between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So in December, when the North Pole and the region associated with with regard to its position of the sun, you can see that it is in the dark zone. So it's entirely darkness. And at the same time, in June, in December, in the winter months, it is actually summer in the southern pole. So the same is the case when in summer, the summer solstice that we call, you will see that the North Pole has a lot more hours of sunlight, whereas the Southern Pole is completely under darkness. So clearly, a lot of birds have adapted to maximizing on this day length across these two hemispheric regions, influencing these birds. This is another fantastic visualization prepared by the Move Back by the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, where you can clearly see how the birds are migrating across the northern and the southern hemisphere. As you can see, a lot of these birds are funneling in and moving into the northern latitudes as the snow up there or the ice sheets start to recede. And that's the region where they're all going to go there to breed. And again, with the onset of the winter months and as it starts to get cold, the birds once again start on their migration. A lot of these birds, you may also notice that they are funneling down into these land bridges or land connectivity, clearly avoiding oceanic barriers and also avoiding areas like the deserts. But having said that, a lot of birds still do undertake these crossings. These areas, what we generally consider as obstacle, seems to be facilitating their migration, as we know now in the case of the Amur falcon. So why did or when did the migrations evolve? So migrations began to evolve with the simple fact that the individuals that moved from one area to another ultimately produced more young, or they were better in their survival ability, and than those that remained in one area. So this over time set into was ingrained into them, and as a result ended up with populations moving from one particular area to another area. Ice ages is said to have played a major role in migration in birds when they may have been forced to move to better habitats and back. So this is clearly the case in many cases, particularly the last glacial events have actually shaped or dictated or determined their wintering grounds. Migratory behavior, as we know now from a few research, continues to evolve because of the changing environment, certain species of birds that have been known to migrate far have now seemed to not migrate really very far, or at least for that matter, certain populations. So clearly, migratory behavior seems to evolve with the changing environment. Now, what triggers migration and how do they navigate? This is again a very unique aspect of research when it comes to understanding bird migrations. So migratory behavior is triggered by seasonal photoperiod. So basically day length. So there are certain parts of the brain, the parietal region, which induces secretions of hormones that will trigger migratory movements. And so this basically the longer the day length, it sets off these secretion of hormones, and this would induce them to or trigger them to start migration. Shortening day lengths affect hormonal levels and induce birds to eat more and store more fat. So increase muscle mass and molt. So what I was earlier telling you about hyperphagia, it's being influenced by the shortening days and the hormonal levels. Later, when these physical changes have taken place, the hormones such as prolactin also cause restlessness. The birds that are ready to migrate, they become restless immediately prior to their departure. So this anxious behavior is described as Zugunruhe. It's a German name and term which refers to this restlessness in birds that are generally migrants. And this has been well studied in a very simple device called the Emlen funnel, wherein there is an ink pad at the base and it's a cage, and the bird gets to view the sky. And this has been tested very much in the Eurasian or the common starling. And what they have generally seen is that at a certain point of time of their migration, either it's spring or it's autumn, they would stop to feed. And even if you provision food to them, they're not interested. All that they're interested in is heading out, and they start jumping around in a certain direction. So if it is spring, it's primarily in northern direction that they're hopping around trying to get out. And as well in the southern, in the autumn period, it is the southern hemisphere. And in experimental setup, where you can have no magnetic field, you see that the birds are basically disoriented or just generally moving everywhere. So there is no specific sense of directionality in experimental setup. So there are a lot of other things that's going on in these birds. And so when it comes to navigation, many of these birds use sun, the position of the sun, the setting of the sun as a compass, and also other celestial bodies. They use this, especially the migrants that are nocturnal. They would use celestial compasses to orient themselves, to correct themselves, course correction with regard to their magnetic compass to set migratory direction. Starlings seem able to negotiate the proper direction only if they have a view of clear sky and sun. Cloud cover seems to induce confusion in these birds. Migratory birds also use the stars to check on their bearing. So experiments carried out in planetarium suggest this. And birds learn the star map as nestlings and use this information to orient their restlessness behavior, that is Zugunruhe. During days of cloudy weather, birds use other cues such as wind and definitely landmarks. So they may be flying low, orienting themselves with landmark. There are a few other cases of birds being able to have a sense of order when we know that birds actually generally lack a good sense of smell. But there are quite a few examples, as in this case, a study in Sweden found that young pigeons learn the orders and this carried by the wind, which reach their home sites. So clearly odor map also may be having a role to play. Then we have the magnetic map. Migratory birds may rely on an instinctive map to find their way back to nesting or wintering sites. So magnetic disturbances may interrupt these abilities. The magnetic compass, many bird species appear to possess a built-in magnetic compass to use on cloudy days. So even though the visibility is very poor, their course is set, they seem to just fly blind. And often, sometimes in such situations, birds too crash into tall buildings if it is in their path of their migration. And so again, this is an example of birds being able to use magnetic or have a sense of magnetic compass. And this have also been tested in controlled environments and wherein there is no sun or stars, and they have been able to understand this better. So physiological evidences supports two magnetic sensing hypotheses. One is known as a magnetite mediated magnetic sense. Now, what exactly happens here is that there is as part of a magnetic map or a signpost sense, the geographic position is set. And so, they have a clear vision in their, in their brain that this is the course that their sensory network is able to understand. There is also the other hypothesis, which is known as vision mediated magnetic compass, wherein there are certain photoreceptor molecules in the bird's eye, which provides an orientation, or basically these photoreceptor molecules actually give the bird a sense of where the magnetic compass is. Either it is the intensity of the magnetic field, and also primarily the orientation of the magnetic field lines. So these putative sensor molecules known as cryptochromes, which possesses the required biophysical properties, are expressed in the retina of migratory birds. So a lot of research on this has been carried out, and they clearly see that there are, in the case of migratory birds, these sensor molecules known as cryptochromes have a major role to play in when it comes to navigation. So these studies have been carried out in the garden warbler known as Sylvia borin, where they have seen this particular cryptochrome, which is known as cluster N. And there is a lot of neuronal activity in these night migratory birds. And as a result, clearly indicates that this has a role in helping orient with regard to the magnetic compass. So very, very interesting piece of work. A simple dominant mutation in something like this is reported enough to trigger the genetics of migration direction. So that's how some of these birds, they may be of the same species, they may be wintering in the same area, but going off to breed in different places. So this is possibly what has led to that. Now, coming to another very exciting area of research, and continues to evolve with technological advancements, and that's about studying bird migration. There is almost 60 to 70% of birds, which is still beyond our ability to put devices on and track their migrations, or to get their in-depth understanding of their migratory strategies or migratory behavior. So a lot of studies in the past and even now are primarily based on citizen science reports, which is basically observational in nature. Sighting records and data put together over large landscapes give us an idea of what is the time of arrival or what is the time of departure. And again, traditional methods such as passive tracking methods such as bird ringing or color banding, which continues to be taken up to this date, have also given us very interesting insights on their destinations, their stopover sites, and also, of course, the timing of migration and arrival at a particular site. The advanced tracking systems primarily involve active tracking methods, which is using satellite transmitters. There is also a lot of nanotechnology that has come in use, so miniaturization of these transmitters. And there are a lot of radio transmitters and GPS transmitters, which I will go through a little later. GPS loggers, which are not any transmitting devices, they just log the data, and you will need to retrieve those tags to go back and draw your course of where these birds have actually come from. The geolocator tags, I had talked to you earlier about in the case of the common swift that was tracked all the way from Beijing all the way down into southern Africa. These geolocators are nothing but logging devices, and they log the light luminescence in a particular region of the planet. So we know that the light intensity varies from the North Pole to the South Pole across time, across season, and also across when you look at it in terms of east-west, given the rotation of the Earth. So these geolocators have come much in use now, though the quality of the data does considerably vary. So for short distance movements that are undertaken by some birds, this particular geolocated tags may not be really useful in determining their migratory routes or migratory paths. So these are examples of those birds which have been tracked or studied using these color bands and numbered bird rings that you see here. There's another case of the greater flamingos and lesser flamingos carrying these rings, and you really don't need to recapture them. You can recite them, and you can see those numbers or those codes, and you can easily tell that these are birds that were tagged in that area and has been seen here. Now, coming to the advanced tracking technology, which is basically the space-based tracking systems. And there are dedicated satellites. As I speak, there are dedicated satellites moving over the Earth, and they carry specialized equipments, what we call the transponders, that are designed to pick up certain frequencies of that are emitted by the transmitters which are deployed on the subjects. It could be birds, any other species that are moving around, and they pick up the signal. So like in this case, this is the Argos satellite, which is a polar orbiting satellite which moves around the poles and placed at a height of 850 kilometers. And they have a radius or a visual or a field of view of nearly 5,000 kilometer diameter. And any time during their path, if they're able to sense a particular transmitter, they pick up those signals and transmit it to the ground station. There is also another space-based tracking system that is still in the making. Or rather, the technology is there and still it's being tested right now. This is about the International Space Station, where you can communicate with the transmitter two-way, because there is somebody sitting there in the space station who can actually communicate to the transmitter as the space station itself is tracking it. So you can change the program that has been pre-programmed in a particular device and deployed on a particular animal. Unlike in the previous case where it is programmed and you will not be in a position to communicate back with it. It's only emitting the signals, and the satellites are designed to pick up that. Whereas here with this, you may be able to. And as a result, these transmitters don't really need to be very big, can be very small. And I think this is the future. In the near future, we'll probably be seeing a lot of smaller individual birds using this. This is another very popular tracking system that is in use at this point of time. Use of solar power cells in the tracking units. As a result, they have become miniaturized because of the ability of the battery to be constantly charged by the solar power cells. And the other interesting aspect of it is that these are GPS satellites. So they communicate to the GPS satellites that are up there in space, store the location within them, and then transmit this location via the mobile phone network, where we know now that mobile phone reach is almost there in almost all parts of the globe. So this again is quite extensively used, and given that it is a GPS transmitter, the GPS locations are far more accurate, and these transmitters can also be programmed to collect a lot more fine scale data, as in they could collect locations every 1 minute or every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. It all depends on what the user requirement is. But this is not possible for many of the other satellite transmitters, or even for that matter, radio transmitters. So this is a case on an example I'm giving you of one of my study species, the common crane, that we have been tracking from Gujarat, from the wintering range. And this is from a GPS GSM transmitter. It has given me almost every 10 minutes location. So this line that you would see here is exactly the path that these birds undertake. And not only that, it gives me almost every site that this bird would stop over. It tells me where all this particular bird has stopped over. So clearly here you can see here, there are these mountain ranges here in Afghanistan, and they're here in Iran, eastern Iran, these mountain ranges. They seem to be funneling out through this. They are crossing this desert and then funneling out through this to enter into the Central Asian region of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and then going all the way up to Kazakhstan. What you will definitely see here is that is very interesting. They breed at about 51-degree longitude, and but they cover from almost 25-degree latitude to about 45 to 50-degree latitude. So latitudinal movement, but they're almost coming in the same longitude. And the distance is about 5,000 kilometers. So they breed in the in the temperate steppe, in the northern latitudes, Mongolian or Kazakh steppe, which are basically rolling highlands, treeless areas. And when they winter in Gujarat, these almost depict the temperate steppe region. So we can call this the subtropical steppe, open flat grasslands, which unfortunately is being invaded by prosopis. So the wintering areas are getting restricted as we speak. One another technology that is now beginning to be extensively used is basically use of mobile network. And these mobile network, there are these specific receiving stations that are deployed. It's quite effectively being used in the whole of North America, but the reach is not very high. So very small transmitters put on these small passerine birds, and when they are flying across, and when they are coming in line of sight of these receiving stations, the receiving stations pick up the location. So over time, all of these locations that these series of receiving stations that have picked up can draw the line for you as to which is the direction that these birds have undertaken on their migration. So this is the current established MOTAS network, primarily confined to North America. But in the coming years, if this particular technology is going to be taken up in a big way in other parts of the world, our ability to track smaller bird species is really, really going to be advanced, and that's definitely going to be very, very useful. So the last section that I'm going to be talking about is about the migration in a changing world. As you all agree that humans, we are going through these Anthropocene era. Humans have literally changed the way the planet is, and this is having influence on a lot of species around us or even far away from us. So this is definitely influencing migration. It is very important to mention that here in India, we have a State of India's Birds a report, which talks about what is happening to all of our birds, the resident birds, migratory birds, and a whole lot of, in fact, all birds. And they all seem to show a clear decline. The migratory birds clearly seem to show a decline in their abundances. And this is also in sync with information that is being presented for birds in other parts of the world. So it is true that we are definitely having negative impacts on migratory birds. Specifically, if you would go into water birds, you can clearly see there are steep declines, and this is really shaping changing. Not only the population is going to be influencing their migratory trajectories or routes and wintering areas. So habitat loss and degradation is foremost one of the major challenges facing many of these migratory birds, reclamation of intertidal habitats. Like I was mentioning to you earlier, the yellow sea intertidal flats are extremely important for a whole series of migratory waders that breed in the Arctic and subarctic region of the East Asian Australasian flyway. A lot of these mudflats are being reclaimed, so there is a loss of habitat. A lot of it's become degraded. Hunting is a major challenge in parts of Africa and in Southeast Asia. Thankfully, in India, it's not a challenge, but there are still pockets where huge number of these birds are being hunted. Not huge, definitely a good number of these birds are hunted. Another challenge is the energy infrastructure. In many of these wintering grounds, wetlands, you have these power lines coming up, which form obstructions or obstacles. A lot of bird collisions happen. A lot of raptors using these energy infrastructure, such as power poles, to as perching sites or vantage points, do get electrocuted. So this is again a serious case, and a far more serious case in the northern latitudes where the landscape is generally very flat. Climate change, as I talked about it earlier, is again clearly documented now in a lot of birds, influencing their food availability and in turn influencing their morphology, whether it's the size or even the beak. There's quite a bit of research being done in the Netherlands that clearly indicates the role of climate change on these impacts on these birds. Yet another and the most critical, something that's become a huge challenge to deal with, is to do with the disease outbreak. It is increasingly becoming a case more often, and it's not confined to a select region of the migratory birds range. In fact, it's happening all across, and it does affect a lot of species. But though we do see a large number of birds or frequency of these disease outbreak happening to a select number of birds, there are innumerable cases. In many cases, it's almost impossible to manage or control these diseases. There are global guidelines and protocols, but effectively trying to mitigate this is still a huge challenge. And like I mentioned earlier, some of these avian diseases are also of concern to human health, especially this H5N1 influenza virus. People do get affected by it. The poultry industry is also completely affected. So this is a big challenge affecting us. So narrating all of these issues that face migratory birds, it's not simply possible for one particular country or one part of their species range to effectively manage, and therefore it requires concerted actions. So the Central Asian flyway is one of the 9 flyways and comprises 30 countries in the range, and a large number of birds in this region migrate into India. So India is one of the most important wintering destinations. So nearly 90% of the species that breed in this region winter in the Indian subcontinent. So it calls for global concerted actions. And that's how these flyways have been identified. And countries come together, decide on action plans, guidelines to how well you can safeguard the interests of migratory birds. And currently, this is taking shape in India. The COVID outbreak did stall this particular issue, but definitely in the coming years, the Central Asian flyway is going to be more active or activated, and we would possibly see better future. I would like to end my presentation with that hopes that each of us individuals and across a region and beyond boundaries, as I started off with my presentation earlier, that migratory birds know no boundaries. They are global citizens, and it's every one of our role to protect and conserve these birds. And migratory birds would continue to amaze us. And with more and more advancement in technology, there's going to be a lot more interesting insights that's going to come to our knowledge, and birds simply fascinate us. So thank you for listening, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Suresh. So there are some questions
Thank you.
from the learners. I
Okay, so let me stop share, and then I go ahead with the questions. Okay, is that fine?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So
okay,
I think everyone can put up some questions, and Suresh will.
I have a question. My name is Sachin.
I'm not able to hear Sachin speaking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I have a question that we have these tagging devices for the birds to track their movement and maybe study more. So I have a few questions related to this. One is whether it actually impacts the balance of the bird, because birds are anyway very small in weight, and the tags might add some additional microweight or whatever I can call it. So
Correct.
do we do that symmetrically to balance their flight and movement and all these things, or not? The second question that I have is about the tracking devices, whether those radiations or magnetic field of the devices impact their magnetic compass or not.
Okay, so yes, you have hit upon a few ethical questions, and there are again, guidelines, so which I did not mention during the presentation. So if you're not only putting transmitters, or for that matter, any devices on birds, the thumb rule is that it should be less than 3% of the body weight. And this has been tested, that anything less than 3% of the body weight on a particular species, then it has minimal impact or no impact. Okay. Of course, when you initially deploy something, a foreign object on the bird is going to be a bit stressed, and it is going to be a question of time. But soon birds get over it. It's almost like wearing a backpack, or even having a earring, or a nose ring. In the initial few days after your piercing, you will constantly keep fiddling around with it. So the birds do tend to check out what is this that they have got on them, and but after that they settle down. So this is based on experimental conditions, and the thumb rule, like I say again, if that bird is very small and your transmitter is more heavier, it's obviously not possible to deploy. Regarding the other point where you talked about balance, yes. So for example, if you're going to, this particularly comes, the issue comes up when you're going to deploy a unit on one side of the wing. So to a certain extent, it would create that imbalance. But again, the weight takes care of it. Okay, so that's the story.
Yeah, the second part about the tracking devices, which has a magnetic field and impact.
Okay, so again, in experimental studies, they have found that these have no or very minimal impact on birds. So this has definitely not influenced their behavior or disoriented them and things like that. So from what the extensive tracking studies that we've been undertaking, this seems to not really have as much an impact on these birds.
Thank you.
Right.
Suresh, from in the chat box, if you can see, there are some questions.
Okay.
Shall I read it out loud? Or
yes. So I can see one of the questions by Grish. How disease infections are controlled in migratory birds, or is there any preventive measures? If there are any medicines, then in which cases and how they are administered? Yeah, so this is, like I said earlier, if it is in a poultry, where you do have disease outbreak, and the poultry industry do go in for culling of infected birds. So if there is a sign of a bird that is diseased, that's one of the methods of controlling the disease. Now, unfortunately, you can't do that with wild birds or with migratory birds. So it's a challenge. Okay. Now, Second issue, or rather the one way that is being practiced is that keeping a constant vigil. If they do find sick birds, they try and capture those sick birds at the earliest so that it does not spread the disease to others, because many of these birds, especially in wetlands where they congregate in very large numbers, there is a very high chance of this disease jumping from one another. So the managers, the field managers, actively try and isolate, remove dead birds from these sites so that you can control these infections. But having said that, it's extremely difficult. And very often birds might show signs of sickness, but you may not be able to capture it. They would fly away again, going and spreading elsewhere. So we'll need to wait till it almost collapses and then go and pick it up. So those are those other challenges. There are certain treatment methods or chemical means by which you can try and clean up the place, but much of it is really not possible. And one of the methods that currently is being practiced is that discourage birds from gathering in select sites. So a lot of birds try and gather in select sites because some of those sites, especially in stopover sites or passage stopover, the departments provision food, as a conscious effort to help these birds migrate across. Okay, and that their habitats have shrunk and their stopover sites are limited. But in a way, you are actually attracting a lot more birds to hang up, to come down and congregate in those areas, and the disease spread is much higher. So it is something that is challenging. Some of the sick birds need really very intensive care. And so you cannot reach out to the entire population. It's not like you can vaccinate them all in one go, which you can possibly do in the poultry farms, but not really possible. So veterinary care is very intensive. Okay, so that is Girish's stuff. And the next one is Ponraj. He asks, fattening of birds will increase the weight, right? It does not affect flying. Usually how much percentage of weight increase during fattening? Okay, so I really don't know this much, but there is a critical mass. So just because food is available, they just can't keep fattening up so much that itself will be a hindrance for the bird's ability to fly. So this dictates as to how much they can stop over. For example, they can only stop over let me put it this way. If a bird cannot fatten up a lot, or the weight is a constraint, then those birds need to stop over at multiple sites, feed, and then proceed. So that is what dictates as to how much they can fatten. Now, there is one which is called, I'm actually running out of time, but I possibly can take one or two, and the rest, they can always write to me and I can respond. Are there any birds which breed in the southern hemisphere and travel to the northern hemisphere for summer? Yes, there are a few birds like the sooty shearwater that I talked about. They breed in the Falkland Islands in the southern hemisphere, sub-Antarctic, and then during the other times of the year, they're moving up all the way across the equator to the northern hemisphere, where they don't breed, but they can move down. Okay, reacted to are there any, okay, sorry. Read in some media that common swift carry a small stick and they take rest on that stick during night. No, that's not true. This is a myth, and that's definitely not true. Okay, so from what we know, why would it sit on a stick? These birds are comfortable on the wing. Not only the common swift and the alpine swift, another related species. They are very interesting species. I didn't talk about the alpine swift. There are records of these birds staying in air without landing for close to 200 days. So they eat, sleep, drink in the air. So they really don't need a stick. They can just float around on the wings.
Hi, Suresh, I think we can
stop here.
Probably have we can stop here.
Yes,
and,
please.
Everyone,
yes.
I think you can put your questions on the discussion forum, and I'll forward you the questions.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for listening. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.